The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Ravencrest Palace as Queen Isabella Ravencrest made her way through the corridors that had housed her family for over 300 years. At 62, she moved with the practiced grace of someone who had never doubted her authority, her steel-gray hair pulled back in an elaborate crown braid that had become her signature. The emerald and diamond tiara that adorned her head caught the light with every step, sending rainbows dancing across the ornate walls lined with portraits of her ancestors. The palace was alive with its usual morning bustle. Servants hurried past with silver trays laden with breakfast delicacies, their footsteps muffled by the thick Persian runners that covered the ancient stone floors. Courtiers in their finest attire whispered among themselves in small groups, their conversations dying to respectful murmurs as the queen passed. The air was thick with the scent of fresh roses from the palace gardens and the faint aroma of beeswax from the countless candles that illuminated the grand hallways. Queen Isabella had ruled the kingdom of Astoria for 37 years, ever since her father, King Edmund the Wise, had passed away in his sleep. She had inherited not just a crown, but a legacy of strength and unwavering leadership that had seen the kingdom through wars, famines, and political upheavals that might have toppled lesser monarchies. Her subjects respected her, her enemies feared her, and her family obeyed her without question. Or so she believed. This particular morning, however, carried an undercurrent of tension that even the most oblivious courtier could feel. Word had spread through the palace like wildfire about the previous night's incident at the royal treasury. Captain Marcus Thornfield, the youngest man ever appointed to lead the royal guard, had discovered irregularities in the kingdom's financial records. Someone had been embezzling from the crown's coffers, and the theft appeared to have been going on for months, possibly years. Captain Thornfield was a man of impeccable reputation and unshakable integrity. At 35, he had already distinguished himself in 3 military campaigns and had personally saved the life of Prince Alexander, the Queen's eldest son and heir to the throne, during an assassination attempt 2 years prior. His appointment as captain of the Royal Guard had been unanimously approved by the Royal Council, a rare occurrence in the politically charged atmosphere of the court. The captain had spent the entire night poring over ledgers, cross-referencing payments with receipts, and tracing the flow of gold through the complex web of the kingdom's finances. What he had discovered made his blood run cold. The missing funds weren't just a few thousand gold pieces that might be explained away as accounting errors or minor corruption. Nearly 500,000 gold crowns had vanished over the past 18 months, enough to fund a small army or build an entire city. More disturbing still was the pattern of the thefts. They coincided perfectly with Queen Isabella's private expenditures, her mysterious trips to the neighboring kingdom of Valdres, and her increasingly secretive meetings with foreign dignitaries. The evidence was circumstantial but damning, and Captain Thornfield knew that presenting his findings to the Queen would be the most dangerous moment of his career. As the Queen approached the throne room for the morning audience, where citizens could petition their monarch for justice or assistance, Captain Thornfield stood at attention beside the massive oak doors. His uniform was immaculate as always, the royal blue fabric adorned with the silver embroidery that denoted his rank. His hand rested casually on the pommel of his ceremonial sword, but his eyes held a steely determination that had not been there the day before. The throne room of Ravencrest Palace was a marvel of medieval architecture and royal grandeur. Soaring stone columns supported a vaulted ceiling painted with scenes from Asturian mythology, while stained glass windows cast colorful patterns across the polished granite floor. The throne itself was carved from a single piece of white marble and inlaid with precious stones that represented the 4 corners of the kingdom. Behind it hung the royal standard, a golden phoenix rising from flames on a field of deep purple. Princess Alara Ravencrest sat in her designated chair to the left of the throne, her posture perfect despite her obvious discomfort with the formal proceedings. At 16, she possessed an unusual combination of her grandmother's sharp intelligence and her late mother's gentle compassion. Her auburn hair was arranged in an elaborate style befitting her station, and her dress of midnight blue silk rustled softly as she shifted in her seat. Unlike many royal children who were content to enjoy the privileges of their birth without understanding the responsibilities, Elara had always been fascinated by the actual work of governance. She had noticed Captain Thornfield's troubled expression the moment she entered the throne room, and, her keen observations had not missed the way several courtiers seemed more nervous than usual. Princess Elara had inherited her grandmother's ability to read people and situations with uncanny accuracy, but she had also developed her own network of information sources among the palace staff. The servants, who were often invisible to the nobility, saw and heard everything, and they had learned to trust the young princess who treated them with genuine kindness and respect. From her conversations with the kitchen maids and stable boys, Elara knew that Captain Thornfield had been seen leaving the Treasury building well past midnight, carrying an armload of financial documents. She also knew that several of the Queen's most trusted advisors had been summoned for emergency meetings throughout the night, and that unusual amounts of gold had been quietly moved from the royal vaults to undisclosed locations. The morning audience proceeded with its usual parade of petitioners. A merchant complained about unfair taxation on his goods, a farmer requested assistance rebuilding his barn after a fire, and a young woman begged for the Queen's intervention in a property dispute with her neighbors. Queen Isabella handled each case with her characteristic efficiency and decisive judgment, but Princess Elara could see the tension building in her grandmother's shoulders with each passing minute. Captain Thornfield had requested a private audience immediately following the public session, and Queen Isabella had agreed, though her tone when granting the request had been noticeably cooler than usual. As the last petitioner bowed and backed away from the throne, the great doors were closed and the throne room was cleared of everyone except the royal family and the captain. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken expectations. Queen Isabella remained seated on her throne, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, but her eyes never left Captain Thornfield's face. Prince Alexander, who had been standing beside his mother's throne throughout the audience, seemed to sense the gravity of the moment and took a small step backward. Princess Elara, however, leaned forward slightly in her chair, her intuition telling her that whatever was about to happen would be significant. Captain Thornfield approached the throne with measured steps, stopping at the prescribed distance before executing a perfect bow. When he straightened, his expression was grave but resolute. He carried a leather portfolio filled with documents, and Princess Elara could see that his knuckles were white from gripping it so tightly. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal, "I must speak with you about a matter of utmost importance to the crown and the kingdom. Last night, while conducting a routine audit of the royal finances as required by the quarterly protocols, I discovered significant irregularities that require immediate attention." Queen Isabella's expression did not change, but Princess Elara noticed a barely perceptible tightening around her grandmother's eyes. The Queen had perfected the art of maintaining her composure under pressure, but 16 years of close observation had taught Elara to recognize the subtle signs of her grandmother's emotional state. "Continue, Captain," Queen Isabella said, her voice carrying the authority of 3 decades on the throne. Captain Thornfield opened his portfolio and withdrew a series of documents covered in columns of numbers and official seals. "Your Majesty, over the past 18 months, approximately 473,000 gold crowns have been withdrawn from the royal treasury without proper authorization or documentation. The withdrawals were made using forged documents bearing the royal seal, and the gold has been transferred to accounts in foreign banks, primarily in Valdres and Morgania." The accusation hung in the air like a sword suspended by a thread. Prince Alexander's sharp intake of breath was audible in the vast space, and Princess Elara felt her heart begin to race. She had expected something significant, but not an accusation of embezzlement against the crown itself. Queen Isabella rose slowly from her throne, her movements controlled but radiating danger. She descended the marble steps one at a time, her eyes never leaving Captain Thornfield's face. When she reached the bottom, she was close enough to touch him, close enough that he could see the fury beginning to kindle in her grey eyes. "Are you suggesting, Captain Thornfield," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout, that someone within my own household has been stealing from me? That someone with access to the royal seal has been forging my authorization and plundering the kingdom's treasury? Captain Thornfield straightened his shoulders and met her gaze without flinching. Your Majesty, I am not suggesting anything. I am presenting you with evidence of what has occurred. The pattern of thefts, the timing of the withdrawals, and the destinations of the gold all point to someone with intimate knowledge of your personal schedule and access to the highest levels of the royal household. What happened next would be debated in the halls of Ravencrest Palace for years to come. Queen Isabella's hand moved with lightning speed toward Captain Thornfield's face, her palm open and her eyes blazing with a fury that seemed to draw its power from the very foundations of her royal authority. The captain stood motionless, his training and his oath preventing him from raising a hand in defense against his sovereign, even as that sovereign prepared to strike him down in her own throne room. But, before the blow could land, a clear young voice cut through the tension with the precision of a blade. Grandmother, please stop. Princess Elara had risen from her chair and taken several steps toward the confrontation, her own eyes reflecting a combination of fear, determination, and something that looked remarkably like disappointment. In that moment, the 16-year-old princess looked every inch a future queen, her posture regal and her voice carrying an authority that belied her youth. Queen Isabella's hand froze in mid-air, trembling with barely contained rage. She turned to face her granddaughter, and, for the first time in Princess Elara's memory, she saw genuine uncertainty in the queen's eyes. Elara, Queen Isabella said, her voice tight with emotion, you do not understand the situation. This man has made accusations against the crown that cannot be tolerated. He has forgotten his place and his duty. Princess Elara took another step closer, her heart pounding but her voice remaining steady. I understand more than you think, grandmother. I understand that Captain Thornfield is an honorable man who has served our family faithfully. I understand that he would never make such serious accusations without evidence to support them. And I understand that striking him will not make the evidence disappear. The throne room fell into a silence so profound that the distant sounds of the palace seemed to fade away entirely. Prince Alexander stood frozen beside the throne, his mouth slightly open and his eyes wide with shock at witnessing his niece challenge his mother's authority. Captain Thornfield remained at attention, though Princess Elara could see the gratitude in his eyes as he realized that she had quite possibly saved him from physical assault. Queen Isabella slowly lowered her hand, but her gaze never left her granddaughter's face. The fury in her eyes was gradually being replaced by something more complex, a mixture of pride, frustration, and what might have been recognition. She saw something of herself in Princess Elara's courage, but also something that she had lost long ago in the corridors of power. You would defend this man against your own blood? Queen Isabella asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Princess Elara straightened her shoulders and looked directly into her grandmother's eyes. I defend what is right, grandmother. Just as you taught me to do. Just as our family has done for 300 years. If Captain Thornfield has evidence of wrongdoing, then we must examine that evidence, not silence the messenger. The standoff continued for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Finally, Queen Isabella turned away from both her granddaughter and the captain, walking slowly back toward her throne. When she reached it, she did not sit down but instead stood with one hand resting on the carved armrest, staring up at the painted ceiling as if seeking guidance from her ancestors. Very well, she said at last, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who had fought too many battles and won too many victories at too high a cost. Present your evidence, Captain Thornfield. Let us see what accusations you dare bring before the throne of Astoria. Princess Elara felt a mixture of relief and apprehension wash over her. She had prevented an immediate crisis, but she sensed that they were all standing at the edge of a much larger precipice. Whatever Captain Thornfield had discovered, whatever secrets lay hidden in the royal finances, she knew that the next few minutes would change everything. As Captain Thornfield opened his portfolio once again and began to lay out documents on the steps leading to the throne, Princess Alara caught her grandmother's eye. For just a moment, Queen Isabella's mask of royal composure slipped, and Alara saw something that shocked her more than any financial scandal ever could. She saw fear. Captain Thornfield's hands remained steady as he spread the damning documents across the marble steps, each piece of parchment a thread in a web of deception that had taken him all night to untangle. The ledgers were bound in rich leather with the royal seal embossed in gold, their pages filled with meticulous entries written in the flowing script of the royal treasurers. But, hidden within those carefully recorded transactions was a pattern that told a story of betrayal at the highest levels of the kingdom. "Your Majesty," Captain Thornfield began, his voice echoing in the vast chamber, "these documents show a series of gold transfers that began approximately 18 months ago. Each withdrawal was authorized with what appears to be your personal seal, but, upon closer examination, the wax impressions show subtle differences from authenticated royal documents." Queen Isabella descended the steps slowly, her silk slippers making no sound on the polished marble. Princess Alara watched her grandmother's face carefully, noting how the queen's eyes moved from document to document with an intensity that suggested she was not seeing this information for the first time. Prince Alexander remained near the throne, his usually confident demeanor replaced by obvious confusion and growing alarm. The first document Captain Thornfield presented was a withdrawal order for 50,000 gold crowns, dated 6 months after Queen Isabella's mysterious diplomatic mission to the Kingdom of Valdres. The mission had been shrouded in secrecy, with even the royal council given only vague explanations about trade negotiations and border security discussions. Princess Alara remembered how unusually secretive her grandmother had been about the trip, declining to share even basic details about the meetings or their outcomes. "This particular transfer," Captain Thornfield continued, pointing to the document with a steady finger, "coincides with reports from our intelligence network about unusual military movements in Valdres. Our spies reported that King Roderick was assembling a mercenary army, ostensibly for defensive purposes, but the timing suggests a different motivation." Queen Isabella picked up the document, studying it with the practiced eye of someone who had reviewed thousands of official papers during her reign. Princess Alara could see her grandmother's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly as she examined the forged seal. The revelation that someone had been using counterfeit royal authorization was serious enough, but the implications of where that gold had gone were far more troubling. "Continue with your accusations, Captain," Queen Isabella said, setting the document down with deliberate care. "I assume you have more than one suspicious transaction to present to us." Captain Thornfield withdrew a second set of documents, these bound with a black ribbon that signified the highest level of confidential royal business. These records show a pattern of payments totaling over 200,000 gold crowns to various accounts controlled by known agents of the Morganian intelligence service. The payments were disguised as legitimate diplomatic expenses, but the amounts far exceed anything that could be justified by normal diplomatic activities. Princess Alara felt a chill run down her spine as she recognized some of the names on the payment records. She had encountered several of these individuals during state functions and diplomatic receptions, charming courtiers who had seemed perfectly ordinary at the time. The idea that they had been foreign spies operating within the very heart of the palace was both terrifying and deeply unsettling. Prince Alexander finally broke his silence, stepping down from the throne platform to join the group around the documents. "Captain Thornfield, you are suggesting that these payments represent some form of treasonous activity. That is an extraordinarily serious accusation that could destabilize the entire kingdom if it were to become public knowledge." "I am aware of the gravity of my findings, Your Highness," Captain Thornfield replied, meeting the prince's gaze directly. "That is precisely why I brought them directly to Her Majesty rather than reporting them through normal channels. The security implications are too significant to risk exposure through standard bureaucratic procedures." Queen Isabella had been unusually quiet during this exchange, but Princess Alara noticed that her grandmother's breathing had become slightly labored, as if she was struggling to maintain her composure under an enormous weight of stress. The Queen's hands, which usually remained perfectly still during official proceedings, were now clasped tightly behind her back, her knuckles white with tension. The third set of documents that Captain Thornfield presented proved to be the most damaging of all. These were copies of correspondence between various Asturian nobles and foreign contacts, intercepted by royal intelligence officers who had been tracking suspicious communication patterns. The letters were written in code, but the royal cryptographers had managed to decipher enough to reveal their true purpose. These communications, Captain Thornfield explained, indicate that several high-ranking members of the Asturian nobility have been providing detailed information about our military capabilities, defensive strategies, and political vulnerabilities to agents representing both Valdres and Morgania. The information being shared would be invaluable to any foreign power considering military action against our kingdom. Princess Alara studied the decrypted portions of the letters, her heart sinking as she recognized the handwriting in several of them. These were not minor courtiers or distant relatives seeking to curry favor with foreign powers. These were trusted advisors, longtime family friends, and respected members of the royal council itself. The web of betrayal reached into the very heart of the kingdom's leadership. But it was the final document that Captain Thornfield presented that caused Queen Isabella's carefully maintained composure to finally crack. It was a single sheet of parchment, bearing the royal seal of Valdres, and it contained a proposal that was breathtaking in its audacity and implications for the future of both kingdoms. King Roderick of Valdres was offering a formal alliance with Queen Isabella, one that would effectively merge the two kingdoms under joint rule. The proposal included detailed plans for dividing territories, sharing military resources, and establishing a new royal dynasty through the marriage of Prince Alexander to King Roderick's daughter, Princess Viviana. Most shocking of all, the document indicated that Queen Isabella had already given preliminary approval to the proposal and had been using Asturian gold to fund the preparations for this dramatic political transformation. "This cannot be authentic," Prince Alexander said, his voice rising with indignation as he read the document. "Mother, you cannot possibly have agreed to such an arrangement without consulting the royal council or even informing your own family. This would mean the effective end of Asturian independence." Queen Isabella remained silent for a long moment, staring at the document as if it contained words written in a language she no longer understood. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried a weight of emotion that Princess Alara had never heard from her grandmother before. "You do not understand the pressures that face a monarch, Alexander. You have never had to make decisions that could save or destroy everything our family has built over 3 centuries. Sometimes the choices available to us are not between good and evil, but between survival and destruction." Princess Alara stepped closer to her grandmother, drawn by the pain she could hear beneath the queen's words. "What pressures, grandmother? What has been happening that could justify betraying our allies and potentially enslaving our people to foreign rule?" The queen turned to face her granddaughter, and, for the first time, Princess Alara saw tears gathering in the corners of her grandmother's eyes. The sight was so shocking that it took her breath away. Queen Isabella Ravencrest had never shown weakness, had never displayed vulnerability, had never allowed anyone to see her as anything other than an unshakable pillar of royal strength. 3 years ago, Queen Isabella began, her voice trembling slightly, "I received intelligence reports indicating that a coalition of 6 neighboring kingdoms was forming an alliance specifically designed to destroy Astoria. Our kingdom sits at the center of the most valuable trade routes in the region, and our military strength has been seen as a threat to their expansion plans. The coalition was preparing for a coordinated invasion that would have overwhelmed our defenses within months." Captain Thornfield listened to this revelation with obvious surprise. As the head of the royal guard, he should have been informed of any major threats to the kingdom's security, but this was the first he had heard of such a massive conspiracy against Astoria. Why was this intelligence not shared with the military leadership? Captain Thornfield asked. "If such a threat existed, we should have been preparing our defenses and seeking our own alliances to counter it." Queen Isabella laughed bitterly, a sound devoid of any humor. "Because the intelligence came from sources that I could not reveal without compromising operations that had taken years to establish. Because the Royal Council would have insisted on diplomatic solutions that would have taken too long to implement. Because sometimes a monarch must act alone to save her kingdom, even if those actions appear treasonous to those who do not understand the full scope of the threat. Princess Alara found herself struggling to reconcile this explanation with the evidence that Captain Thornfield had presented. Even if her grandmother's fears about foreign invasion were justified, the solution appeared to be surrendering the kingdom's independence voluntarily rather than fighting to preserve it. "But, grandmother," Princess Alara said carefully, "if you believed that Astoria was in danger, why did you not seek help from our traditional allies? The kingdom of Eravia has been our friend for over a century, and the free cities of the northern coast have always supported our independence. Surely there were alternatives to this arrangement with Valdres." Queen Isabella's expression darkened, and Princess Alara caught a glimpse of the fury that had nearly led to violence against Captain Thornfield. Our traditional allies had already been compromised. Eravia received substantial bribes to remain neutral in any conflict involving Astoria, and the free cities were promised expanded trade rights in exchange for their non-interference. We were alone, surrounded by enemies and abandoned by those we had trusted for generations. The scope of the conspiracy that Queen Isabella was describing was staggering in its complexity and reach. If her information was accurate, then Astoria had indeed been facing an existential threat that required desperate measures to counter. But Princess Alara found herself questioning whether the cure her grandmother had chosen was worse than the disease. "So your solution," Prince Alexander said, his voice heavy with disbelief, "was to hand over our kingdom to King Roderick and hope that he would prove to be a benevolent ruler? To betray the trust of our people and sell their freedom for the promise of protection?" Queen Isabella whirled to face her son, her composure finally shattering completely. "My solution was to ensure that you would have a kingdom to inherit rather than a pile of ashes. My solution was to preserve the royal bloodline and the lives of our people, even if it meant sacrificing some of our sovereignty. You speak of betrayal, but you have no idea what it means to carry the weight of an entire kingdom's survival on your shoulders." The Queen's outburst echoed through the throne room, bouncing off the ancient stone walls and painted ceiling. For several moments, the only sound was her labored breathing as she struggled to regain control of her emotions. Princess Alara realized that she was witnessing the collapse of the myth of royal infallibility that had sustained her family for centuries. Captain Thornfield cleared his throat carefully, drawing attention back to the documents spread across the marble steps. "Your Majesty, regardless of the motivations behind these actions, the fact remains that substantial sums of royal gold have been transferred to foreign accounts without proper authorization. As Captain of the Royal Guard, I am sworn to protect the Crown's interests, and I must ask how you intend to address these irregularities." The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Princess Alara could see that they had reached a critical moment in the crisis. Her grandmother's explanations, however, well-intentioned, did not change the legal reality of what had occurred. The unauthorized transfers of gold constituted embezzlement under Asturian law, regardless of the Queen's motivations or the threats she believed the kingdom was facing. Queen Isabella straightened her shoulders and seemed to draw strength from some deep well of royal determination. When she spoke again, her voice had regained much of its usual authority, though the emotional cracks were still visible beneath the surface. "Captain Thornfield, you have presented serious accusations and I have provided you with explanations for the actions in question. However, I recognize that explanations alone cannot resolve the legal and practical implications of what has occurred. Therefore, I am prepared to make the following proposal." Princess Alara held her breath, sensing that whatever her grandmother said next would determine the fate of the kingdom and, quite possibly the future of the royal family itself. The stakes had become so high that there seemed to be no safe path forward, only a choice between various forms of catastrophic risk. "I will provide a full accounting of every gold piece that has been transferred, along with detailed documentation of the intelligence that drove my decisions. I will submit to questioning by the Royal Council and accept whatever judgment they render regarding my actions. In exchange, I ask for your silence about these matters until the Council has had an opportunity to review all of the evidence and determine the best course of action for the kingdom." It was a remarkable offer from someone who had never before submitted her authority to external review. But, Princess Alara could see that Captain Thornfield was still troubled by the proposal, and, she suspected that her uncle, Prince Alexander, would have strong objections to any arrangement that might expose the royal family to public scrutiny and, potential scandal. Before anyone else could respond, Princess Alara stepped forward and, placed herself directly between her grandmother and, Captain Thornfield. She looked from one to the other, then, at her uncle, and, realized that the moment had come for her to make a choice that would define her own future role in the kingdom. "I have a different proposal," she said, her voice clear and, strong despite the magnitude of what she was about to suggest. "One that I believe will serve the kingdom's interests better than either continued secrecy or immediate public revelation." The silence that followed Princess Alara's declaration was so profound that even the ancient palace itself seemed to hold its breath. 3 pairs of eyes focused on the 16-year-old princess with varying degrees of surprise, concern, and curiosity. Queen Isabella's expression showed a mixture of pride and apprehension, as if she recognized that her granddaughter had inherited not just the royal bloodline, but the dangerous courage that came with it. Princess Alara took a deep breath, drawing upon every lesson in statecraft and diplomacy that her tutors had drilled into her over the years. She had spent countless hours studying the great queens and princesses of history, learning how they had navigated crises that threatened to destroy their kingdoms. Now, standing in the throne room where her ancestors had made decisions that shaped the fate of nations, she felt the weight of their legacy pressing down upon her shoulders. "Captain Thornfield," she began, turning to address the man whose discoveries had set this crisis in motion, "you have uncovered evidence of serious irregularities in the royal finances. However, you have also heard explanations that suggest these irregularities may have been motivated by legitimate concerns for the kingdom's security. Before we proceed with any formal accusations or investigations, don't you think we should verify the intelligence that supposedly justified these actions?" Captain Thornfield considered her words carefully. As a military man, he understood the importance of gathering complete intelligence before making strategic decisions. "Your Highness raises an excellent point. If Her Majesty's claims about foreign threats are accurate, then, the context of these financial transactions changes significantly. However, verifying such intelligence would require access to sources and methods that may be highly classified." Princess Alara nodded, having anticipated this objection. "Which is why I propose that we form a small, trusted investigative committee consisting of the 4 people in this room. We have the knowledge, the authority, and the motivation necessary to uncover the truth without risking exposure of sensitive information or premature public panic." Queen Isabella studied her granddaughter with new respect. The proposal was politically astute, offering a path forward that could potentially resolve the crisis without destroying the monarchy's credibility or exposing state secrets to hostile foreign powers. However, it also represented a fundamental shift in the traditional power structure of the kingdom. "You are suggesting," Queen Isabella said slowly, "that I submit my actions and decisions to review by a committee that includes individuals who are not bound by the same oath of loyalty that governs the Royal Council. Captain Thornfield, while honorable, is ultimately a military officer whose primary allegiance is to the institution of the monarchy rather than to me personally." Princess Alara met her grandmother's gaze steadily. "I am suggesting that we prioritize the welfare of the kingdom above personal pride or traditional protocols. If your actions were justified by legitimate threats, then, an honest investigation will vindicate you and strengthen your position. If there were errors in judgment or execution, then, we need to understand those errors so that they can be corrected before they cause irreparable damage." Prince Alexander had remained unusually quiet during this exchange, but, now he stepped forward with obvious reluctance. As heir to the throne, he understood better than anyone how dangerous it could be to establish precedents that might constrain royal authority or subject the monarchy to external oversight. "Alara, while I admire your intentions, you must consider the broader implications of what you are proposing. If word spreads that the reigning monarch has been subjected to investigation by her own family and military officers, it could undermine confidence in the crown throughout the kingdom and beyond. Our enemies would see it as a sign of weakness and internal division." Princess Alara had anticipated this objection as well, and, her response revealed the depth of thought she had given to the political ramifications of the crisis. "Uncle Alexander, our enemies already have reasons to view us as weak and divided. According to grandmother's intelligence, they have been planning our destruction for years and have successfully isolated us from our traditional allies. The question is not whether we appear vulnerable, but whether we actually become strong enough to survive what is coming." The princess moved to the documents that Captain Thornfield had spread across the marble steps, studying them with the analytical skills that her tutors had praised since childhood. Her education had included extensive training in finance, diplomacy, and military strategy, subjects that were sometimes considered inappropriate for royal daughters but which Queen Isabella had insisted upon. "Look at these payment records," Princess Alara continued, pointing to specific entries in the financial ledgers. "If we assume that grandmother's intelligence about foreign threats was accurate, then, these payments represent either a desperate attempt to buy time and allies, or they represent the successful infiltration of our government by hostile foreign agents. Either way, we need to understand exactly what information was shared, what promises were made, and what obligations we may have inadvertently created." Captain Thornfield nodded in agreement, recognizing the strategic wisdom in Princess Alara's analysis. "Her Highness is correct. From a security perspective, we need to conduct damage assessment and threat analysis regardless of whether criminal charges are ultimately filed. The kingdom's defensive posture depends on understanding what our enemies know about our capabilities and intentions." Queen Isabella walked slowly to one of the tall windows that looked out over the palace gardens, her hands clasped behind her back in the pose that had become her signature during difficult deliberations. The morning sun had risen higher, casting sharper shadows across the carefully manicured lawns and flower beds that had been tended by royal gardeners for generations. From this vantage point, she could see the capital city spreading out beyond the palace walls, thousands of citizens going about their daily lives, unaware that their queen was grappling with decisions that could determine their future freedom or enslavement. "Very well," she said at last, turning back to face the others. "I accept your proposal, Alara, but with specific conditions that must be agreed upon before we proceed. First, everything we discover or discuss remains absolutely confidential until we have reached a consensus about how to proceed. Second, any decisions made by this committee must be unanimous, meaning that each of us has veto power over proposed courses of action. Third, we have exactly 1 week to complete our investigation and reach our conclusions." Princess Alara felt a surge of relief and apprehension. Her grandmother's acceptance of the proposal was a remarkable concession from someone who had never before allowed her authority to be questioned, but the conditions attached to that acceptance created new challenges and potential complications. "I agree to your conditions, grandmother, but I would like to add one of my own. During our investigation, all 4 of us must have equal access to information and equal voice in our deliberations. Traditional protocols regarding royal hierarchy will be suspended within our committee, allowing us to speak and act as partners in uncovering the truth." The request was audacious, effectively asking Queen Isabella to temporarily surrender her position as the ultimate authority in the kingdom. For several tense moments, it seemed as though the queen might reject the entire proposal rather than accept such a fundamental challenge to her sovereignty. Finally, Queen Isabella nodded slowly. "Agreed. For the duration of our investigation, we will function as equals united by our shared commitment to Astoria's survival and prosperity." Captain Thornfield and Prince Alexander both expressed their agreement to the terms, and Princess Alara felt as though they had successfully navigated the first major crisis of what promised to be an extremely difficult week. However, she also realized that they had only addressed the immediate procedural questions without confronting the substantive issues that had created the crisis in the first place. "Now," Princess Alara said, taking charge of the committee she had essentially created, "we need to establish our investigative priorities and divide our responsibilities. Captain Thornfield, I assume you can provide us with additional details about the financial irregularities you discovered, including the specific methods used to forge the royal authorization documents." Captain Thornfield retrieved his leather portfolio and withdrew additional documents that he had not yet presented to the group. I have traced the forged seals to a specific workshop in the capital city, one that specializes in high-quality reproductions of official documents for legitimate purposes such as historical research and legal proceedings. However, the craftsman who created these particular forgeries disappeared from the city 3 days ago, just hours after I began my investigation. The revelation that the forger had fled suggested a level of coordination and advance warning that was deeply troubling. If the people responsible for the unauthorized financial transfers had been monitoring Captain Thornfield's investigation, then, they possessed intelligence capabilities that extended far beyond what would be expected from ordinary criminals or corrupt courtiers. Uncle Alexander, Princess Alara continued, I need you to review the diplomatic correspondence and intelligence reports that grandmother mentioned. We need to verify the existence and scope of the foreign threats that supposedly justified these extraordinary measures. Prince Alexander nodded, though his expression remained skeptical. I will contact our intelligence service and request access to all relevant reports and assessments. However, Alara, you must understand that much of this information may be compartmentalized or restricted in ways that limit our ability to fully verify its accuracy. Princess Alara turned to her grandmother, knowing that the most difficult conversation was yet to come. Grandmother, I need you to provide us with a complete timeline of your communications with King Roderick and any other foreign contacts involved in this proposed alliance. We also need to understand the specific terms of any agreements you may have made, either formally or informally. Queen Isabella's jaw tightened slightly, but she maintained her composure. The communications with Valdres began approximately 2 years ago, initially as routine diplomatic exchanges about trade and border security. However, as the intelligence reports about the hostile coalition became more detailed and credible, those communications evolved into discussions about mutual defense and strategic cooperation. The Queen moved to a small writing desk in the corner of the throne room, retrieving a locked wooden box that contained what appeared to be highly confidential documents. These are copies of my personal correspondence with King Roderick, along with preliminary agreements that we have discussed but not yet finalized. You will find that the arrangements are more complex and nuanced than the single document that Captain Thornfield presented would suggest. Princess Alara accepted the box from her grandmother, feeling the weight of both the physical documents and the political secrets they contained. What is my role in this investigation? I need specific responsibilities that will contribute to our understanding of the situation. Queen Isabella smiled for the first time since the crisis had begun, recognizing something of herself in her granddaughter's determination to take an active role in resolving the crisis rather than simply observing from the sidelines. Alara, your role will be the most challenging of all. I need you to review our kingdom's historical relationships with our neighbors, looking for patterns and precedents that might help us understand the current threats and opportunities. More importantly, I need you to think like a future queen and consider what course of action would best serve Astoria's long-term interests, regardless of the short-term political costs. The assignment was both an honor and a burden, recognizing Princess Alara's intellectual capabilities while also placing her in the position of potentially having to choose between loyalty to her family and loyalty to her kingdom. She understood that her grandmother was testing her as much as trusting her, preparing her for the kinds of impossible decisions that every monarch eventually faced. As the 4 members of the newly formed investigative committee prepared to disperse and begin their individual tasks, Princess Alara felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation about what they might discover. She had successfully prevented an immediate crisis from exploding into violence, but she suspected that the revelations to come would test all of their loyalties and convictions in ways that none of them could fully anticipate. We will reconvene here tomorrow morning at dawn, Queen Isabella announced. Each of us will present our findings and we will begin to piece together a comprehensive understanding of our situation. Until then, remember that the fate of the kingdom may well depend on our ability to uncover the truth and act wisely upon what we discover. As Captain Thornfield gathered his documents and Prince Alexander headed toward the royal archives, Princess Alara remained in the throne room with her grandmother. The 2 women stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, both lost in contemplation of the enormous challenges that lay ahead. Alara, Queen Isabella said quietly, you have shown remarkable courage and wisdom today. However, you must prepare yourself for the possibility that our investigation will uncover truths that are painful and complicated. The choices facing us may not include any options that are entirely honorable or entirely safe." Princess Alara nodded, understanding that her grandmother was trying to prepare her for revelations that might force them to choose between various forms of betrayal or compromise. "I understand, grandmother. But, whatever we discover, we will face it together and make the best decisions we can with the information available to us." Queen Isabella reached out and took her granddaughter's hand, a gesture of affection that was rare in their formal relationship. "You remind me of myself at your age, before the crown taught me that sometimes good intentions must yield to harsh realities. I hope that you will be wiser and luckier than I have been." As Princess Alara left the throne room to begin her own investigation, she carried with her the weight of her grandmother's hopes and fears, along with a growing understanding of the terrible isolation that came with ultimate responsibility for a kingdom's survival. The next 6 days would test everything she had learned about leadership, loyalty, and the price of power. The Royal Library of Ravencrest Palace stood as one of the great wonders of the known world, its towering shelves containing over 50,000 volumes collected across 3 centuries of royal patronage and scholarly pursuit. Ancient tapestries depicting the kingdom's history hung between massive oak bookcases that stretched from the marble floor to the painted vault ceiling. Princess Alara had always found solace in this vast repository of knowledge, but, on this particular morning, the familiar comfort was overshadowed by the weight of the investigation she had undertaken. She had arrived before dawn, lighting the great reading candles herself rather than summoning the usual servants. The task her grandmother had assigned required not just research, but deep contemplation of patterns and possibilities that might not be apparent to casual observers. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the tall windows, Princess Alara spread dozens of historical texts, diplomatic records, and genealogical charts across the massive central reading table. The history of Astoria's relationships with its neighbors revealed a complex web of alliances, betrayals, and shifting power dynamics that had been evolving for centuries. What struck Princess Alara immediately was how often the kingdom had found itself in situations remarkably similar to their current crisis. Time and, again, Astoria's strategic location and wealth had made it a target for ambitious neighboring rulers who sought to expand their territories or control valuable trade routes. The most relevant precedent appeared to be the crisis of 1847, when King Edmund the Wise, Princess Alara's great-grandfather, had faced a coalition of 4 neighboring kingdoms that sought to partition Astoria among themselves. The official histories praised King Edmund's brilliant diplomatic maneuvering and strategic alliances that ultimately preserved the kingdom's independence, but Princess Alara's careful reading revealed troubling details that had been glossed over or omitted entirely. According to private correspondence that she found in the restricted archives, King Edmund had seriously considered accepting a proposal similar to the one currently being offered by King Roderick of Valdres. The proposal would have placed Astoria under the protection of the powerful Kingdom of Aravia in exchange for substantial autonomy in domestic affairs but complete subordination in foreign policy and military matters. Only the last-minute discovery that Aravia was secretly coordinating with the hostile coalition had prevented King Edmund from essentially surrendering his kingdom's sovereignty. The parallels to their current situation were both illuminating and disturbing. If Queen Isabella's intelligence about a 6-kingdom coalition was accurate, then Astoria was facing an even more dire threat than the one that had nearly destroyed King Edmund's reign. However, the historical precedent suggested that apparent allies and potential protectors might themselves be part of the larger conspiracy against Asturian independence. Princess Alara's investigation was interrupted by the arrival of a palace messenger carrying an urgent communication from Captain Thornfield. The message was brief but alarming. His inquiry into the forged royal seals had uncovered evidence that similar forgeries had been created over the past 2 years, suggesting that the unauthorized financial transfers were part of a much larger and more systematic operation than initially suspected. She immediately set aside her historical research and made her way to Captain Thornfield's office in the Palace Guard complex. The building was a fortress within a fortress, its thick stone walls and narrow windows designed to withstand siege conditions. Captain Thornfield's personal office reflected his military background, with maps of the kingdom's defenses covering every wall and weapons from his various campaigns displayed alongside commendations and battle honors. "Your Highness," Captain Thornfield said, rising from behind a desk covered with financial documents and intelligence reports, "thank you for responding so quickly to my message. What I have discovered overnight has significantly expanded the scope of our investigation." He led her to a large table where he had arranged dozens of documents in chronological order, creating a timeline that stretched back over 2 years. These are all instances where forged royal authorizations were used to transfer gold, manipulate trade agreements, or authorize military movements without proper oversight. The total value of the unauthorized activities exceeds 800,000 gold crowns, nearly double what we calculated yesterday. Princess Alara studied the timeline, noting patterns that were both subtle and deeply troubling. The forged authorizations had been used not just to transfer gold to foreign accounts, but to approve the sale of military equipment to potential enemies, to grant exclusive trade rights to foreign merchants, and to authorize the movement of Astrian troops away from strategically important border positions. "Captain," she said, her voice tight with growing alarm, "these documents suggest that someone has been systematically weakening our kingdom's defenses while simultaneously enriching potential enemies. If this pattern is accurate, then, we may already be compromised to a degree that makes effective resistance impossible." Captain Thornfield nodded grimly. "That is precisely my concern, Your Highness. However, what is most troubling is the sophistication and coordination required to execute such an operation. This is not the work of a few corrupt officials or even a small conspiracy. This represents a level of planning and intelligence gathering that could only be accomplished by a major foreign power with extensive resources and long-term strategic objectives." Princess Alara felt a chill as she considered the implications of Captain Thornfield's analysis. If he was correct, then, Queen Isabella's fears about a coordinated threat to the kingdom were not just justified but potentially understated. The evidence suggested that Astoria was not merely facing a military invasion, but a comprehensive campaign of political and economic subversion that had been underway for years. "Have you been able to identify any patterns in the timing or targets of these forged authorizations?" she asked, studying the documents more closely. Captain Thornfield pointed to several clusters of activity on his timeline. "The pattern becomes clearer when you correlate the forgeries with major political events in neighboring kingdoms. For example, this series of unauthorized gold transfers coincides exactly with King Roderick's consolidation of power in Valdres following his father's death. These military equipment sales correspond to the period when the Morganian Empire was rebuilding its army after their defeat in the Eastern Campaign. The implications were staggering. If the timing patterns were not coincidental, then, the forged authorizations had been deliberately coordinated to strengthen potential enemies at precisely the moments when they needed additional resources to pursue their expansion plans. Astoria had not just been weakened, but had been forced to participate in financing its own potential destruction. Princess Alara's investigation was interrupted by the arrival of Prince Alexander, who appeared visibly shaken by whatever he had discovered in his review of the kingdom's intelligence reports. His usually impeccable appearance was disheveled, his formal court attire wrinkled as if he had spent the entire night poring over classified documents without pause. "Alara, Captain Thornfield," Prince Alexander said without his usual formal greetings, "we need to convene our committee immediately. What I have found in the intelligence archives changes everything we thought we understood about our situation." They made their way quickly back to the throne room, where Queen Isabella was already waiting with her own collection of documents and correspondence. The Queen appeared to have aged years overnight, the stress of the investigation evident in the new lines around her eyes and the slight tremor in her hands as she arranged papers on the table. "Before we begin," Queen Isabella said once they had all assembled, "I must confess that my initial explanations yesterday were incomplete. I withheld certain information not out of dishonesty, but because I was not certain how much of the truth any of us could safely handle. However, given what we are discovering through our individual investigations, I believe complete disclosure is now necessary." Princess Alara exchanged glances with Captain Thornfield and Prince Alexander, sensing that they were about to learn something that would fundamentally alter their understanding of the crisis and, quite possibly change the course of the kingdom's history. Queen Isabella withdrew a sealed document from her personal collection, one that bore not just the royal seal of Astoria but also the seals of 5 other kingdoms. "This is a copy of the Valdres Compact, a secret agreement signed 18 months ago by 6 neighboring rulers. The compact establishes a formal alliance with the stated purpose of restoring stability and proper governance to the central territories of the continent." The euphemistic language could not disguise the document's true purpose, which was the coordinated conquest and partition of Astoria among the signatory kingdoms. The compact included detailed plans for dividing Asturian territory, redistributing the kingdom's wealth, and absorbing its population into the expanding territories of its neighbors. Most chilling of all, the document specified that the royal family would be permitted to choose between exile or execution, but would under no circumstances be allowed to retain any claim to sovereignty over Asturian lands. "How did you obtain this document?" Captain Thornfield asked, his military training helping him maintain composure despite the magnitude of what they were learning. Queen Isabella's expression was grim as she explained. "It was provided to me by King Roderick himself, along with his proposal for an alternative arrangement. According to Roderick, he was the only member of the coalition who had reservations about the compact's provisions for our royal family. His offer of merger rather than conquest was presented as an act of mercy rather than mere political calculation." Prince Alexander studied the document with obvious horror. "This means that Mother's negotiations with Valdres were not a betrayal of our kingdom, but an attempt to salvage something from an impossible situation. Faced with the choice between destruction and absorption, she chose absorption." Princess Alara felt as though the foundations of everything she had believed about their situation were crumbling beneath her feet. Her grandmother's seemingly treasonous actions were revealed to be desperate attempts at damage control in the face of an existential threat that offered no honorable alternatives. "But, grandmother," she said carefully, "even if the threat was real and the choices were limited, why did you not seek help from our traditional allies or appeal to the Continental Council for protection? Surely there were alternatives to surrender, even if those alternatives carried significant risks." Queen Isabella laughed bitterly, producing another set of documents from her collection. "I did seek help, Alara. I appealed to every ally, every neutral power, and every international institution that might have provided assistance. These are their responses." The documents made for deeply depressing reading. Eravia had declined to provide military assistance, citing domestic concerns and budget constraints. The free cities of the northern coast had expressed sympathy but claimed that their own security situations prevented them from extending aid to distant allies. Even the Continental Council had responded with vague expressions of concern but no concrete offers of intervention or protection. Most revealing of all was a confidential communication from the Arabian ambassador, which suggested that Astoria's predicament was viewed by other powers as an inevitable correction to an unsustainable geopolitical situation. The kingdom had grown too wealthy and too strategically important for its own good, and its neighbors' desire to claim shares of that wealth and strategic position was considered a natural and, ultimately irresistible force. "So we were truly alone," Captain Thornfield said, his voice reflecting the despair that they were all feeling. "Our allies abandoned us, our enemies united against us, and international law proved worthless when confronted with coordinated aggression by multiple sovereign powers." Princess Alara struggled to process the enormity of what they had learned. Every assumption she had made about their kingdom's position in the world, every belief she had held about the reliability of alliances and international institutions, had been revealed to be naive idealism. The world of realpolitik was far crueler and more ruthless than her education had prepared her to understand. "There is one more revelation," Queen Isabella said quietly, producing a final document that she had clearly been reluctant to share. "The intelligence about the Six Kingdom Coalition was not obtained through our normal diplomatic channels or spy networks. It was provided to me directly by agents of the Morganian Empire, along with an offer of protection in exchange for certain considerations. The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. The Morganian Empire was the most powerful and aggressive force on the continent, a militaristic state that had been systematically conquering or subordinating smaller kingdoms for decades. An offer of protection from Morgania was like an offer of protection from a wolf pack, likely to result in the complete loss of independence and, possibly the complete destruction of Asturian culture and institutions. What considerations did they demand? Prince Alexander asked, though his tone suggested that he dreaded hearing the answer. Queen Isabella met his gaze directly. Complete integration into the Morganian Empire within 5 years, the dissolution of our parliament and aristocracy, the conversion of our population to Morganian legal and religious systems, and the marriage of our heir to a member of the Morganian royal family. Princess Alara felt dizzy as she contemplated the 3 impossible choices that had faced her grandmother: destruction by the Six Kingdom coalition, absorption by Valdres with some preservation of royal status, or complete obliteration of Asturian identity through integration into the Morganian Empire. Each alternative represented a different form of national death, with only minor variations in the suffering imposed on the royal family and the general population. So the unauthorized financial transfers, she said slowly, working through the logic of her grandmother's position, were attempts to buy time while exploring all possible alternatives to these 3 forms of national suicide. Queen Isabella nodded sadly. I was trying to delay the coalition's timeline while building relationships with potential protectors and searching for alternatives that might preserve some vestige of our independence. The gold that was transferred was not stolen for personal gain, but invested in a desperate search for salvation that ultimately proved futile. As the 4 members of their investigative committee absorbed the full scope of the crisis facing their kingdom, Princess Alara realized that they had reached the point where knowledge had become a burden rather than a tool. Understanding the true nature of their situation had not provided them with better options, but had instead revealed the terrible inadequacy of all available choices. The question now was not whether Queen Isabella's actions had been justified by circumstances, but whether their committee could identify any course of action that might yet save something worth preserving from the wreckage of their kingdom's independence. The dawn of the 7th day found the 4 members of the investigative committee assembled once again in the throne room, but the atmosphere had changed dramatically from their first tense confrontation. The accumulated weight of their discoveries had transformed their relationship from one of accusation and defense to one of shared burden and collective responsibility. They were no longer adversaries seeking to assign blame, but partners attempting to navigate an impossible situation that offered no clearly honorable solutions. Princess Alara had spent the previous night in sleepless contemplation, walking the palace corridors and gardens as she struggled to synthesize everything they had learned into some form of coherent strategy. The historical precedents she had studied offered little guidance for their current predicament, as previous crises had involved smaller coalitions and clearer alternatives. The scope of the threat facing Astoria was unprecedented in the kingdom's 300-year history. Queen Isabella sat not on her throne but in a simple chair beside the others, a symbolic gesture that acknowledged the temporary suspension of traditional hierarchy that they had agreed upon at the beginning of their investigation. Her royal bearing remained intact, but Princess Alara could see that the stress of the past week had taken a significant toll on her grandmother's health and composure. Captain Thornfield had completed his analysis of the kingdom's military situation, and his assessment was grimly realistic. Even if every able-bodied citizen could be armed and trained, Astoria could not hope to resist the combined military forces of 6 neighboring kingdoms for more than a few months. The kingdom's defensive advantages were significant but not insurmountable, and the systematic weakening of their position through the forged authorizations had compromised several key strategic assets. Prince Alexander had finished his review of the diplomatic options, and his conclusions were equally pessimistic. The international community's response to Astoria's appeals for assistance had demonstrated that no external help would be forthcoming. The kingdom would face its crisis alone, without allies and without recourse to international law or mediation. Before we discuss potential courses of action, Princess Alara said, taking the lead in their final deliberation, I think we need to acknowledge something that none of us has stated explicitly. We are not just choosing between different strategies for preserving our kingdom's independence. We are choosing between different forms of defeat, different ways of managing the end of Astoria as we have known it. The stark honesty of her assessment hung in the air like a funeral shroud, but Princess Alara believed that clear thinking required confronting harsh realities rather than clinging to comfortable illusions. Their investigation had revealed that traditional concepts of victory and defeat were no longer applicable to their situation. Given that sobering context, she continued, our responsibility is not to find a way to preserve everything we value, but to determine what aspects of our kingdom's legacy are most worth preserving and what sacrifices we are willing to make to preserve them. Queen Isabella regarded her granddaughter with a mixture of pride and sadness. At 16, Princess Alara was demonstrating a level of political maturity and strategic thinking that typically took decades to develop. However, the Queen also recognized that such premature wisdom came at a terrible personal cost, robbing her granddaughter of the innocence and optimism that should have been her birthright. What do you propose, Alara? Queen Isabella asked quietly. Princess Alara rose from her chair and walked to the great windows that overlooked the capital city, where thousands of citizens were beginning their daily routines, unaware that their princess was contemplating decisions that would determine their fate for generations to come. I propose that we reject all three of the alternatives that have been offered to us, she said, turning back to face the others. The Six Kingdom Coalition's plan for partition, King Roderick's proposal for merger with Valdres, and the Morganian Empire's offer of protection all require us to surrender the fundamental principle that has defined our kingdom for 3 centuries, the idea that the people of Astoria have the right to determine their own destiny through their chosen representatives. Captain Thornfield leaned forward with obvious interest. Your Highness, while I admire the principled nature of that position, I must ask what practical alternative you envision. We cannot simply declare our independence and expect our enemies to respect that declaration. Princess Alara returned to her seat and spread out a map of the continent that she had marked with various annotations during her research. We cannot defeat 6 kingdoms in conventional warfare, but we might be able to make the conquest of Astoria so costly and complicated that our enemies begin to question whether their objectives are worth the price they would have to pay. The strategy she outlined was audacious in its scope and terrifying in its implications. Rather than attempting to defend fixed positions against overwhelming odds, Princess Alara proposed that Astoria should prepare for a campaign of sustained resistance that would deny their enemies the benefits they hoped to gain from conquest. The plan involved several interconnected elements, each designed to make Asturian territory as ungovernable and unprofitable as possible for occupying forces. The kingdom's wealth would be transferred to secure locations in neutral territories, denying invaders access to the economic benefits they sought. Critical infrastructure would be prepared for systematic destruction, ensuring that conquerors inherited ruins rather than functioning systems. Most importantly, the population would be educated and equipped for prolonged resistance activities that would make peaceful occupation impossible. This strategy, Princess Alara explained, is based on the principle that empires expand because expansion is profitable and relatively easy. If we can make the conquest of Astoria unprofitable and extremely difficult, we create incentives for our enemies to seek easier targets or to negotiate more reasonable terms for coexistence. Prince Alexander studied the map and the detailed plans that his niece had developed, recognizing both the strategic sophistication of her thinking and the enormous human cost that implementing such a strategy would require. Alara, he said carefully, what you are proposing is essentially the transformation of our entire kingdom into a battlefield for an indefinite period. The civilian population would endure years of hardship, danger, and uncertainty. Many would die, and those who survived would face a future very different from anything they have known. Princess Alara met her uncle's gaze directly, acknowledging the moral weight of what she was suggesting. Uncle Alexander, every alternative we have discussed involves the destruction of our people's freedom and dignity. King Roderick's merger proposal would reduce them to subjects of a foreign crown. The Morganian offer would erase their cultural identity entirely. The Six Kingdom partition would divide families and communities among multiple hostile rulers. She paused, allowing the implications of these alternatives to settle in their minds before continuing. My proposal offers something that none of the others do, the possibility, however, distant and difficult to achieve, that our people might eventually regain their independence through their own efforts rather than having to accept permanent subjugation. Queen Isabella had remained silent during this exchange, but now she spoke with the weight of 3 decades of royal responsibility. Ilara, your strategy is brilliant in conception, but it requires something that I am not certain I have the right to demand from our people, the sacrifice of their immediate welfare and security for the sake of abstract principles and uncertain future benefits. The queen rose from her chair and walked to the throne that had been the symbol of her authority for so many years. She placed her hand on the carved armrest, drawing strength from the connection to her ancestors who had faced their own impossible choices. However, she continued, I also recognize that my attempts to find alternative solutions have failed completely. The traditional tools of diplomacy, alliance building, and international law have proven inadequate to protect our kingdom from the ambitions of our neighbors. Perhaps it is time to consider unconventional approaches that our enemies would not anticipate or prepare for. Captain Thornfield stood as well, his military bearing reflecting the gravity of the moment. Your Majesty, if we choose to implement Princess Ilara's strategy, we would need to begin preparations immediately. The intelligence reports suggest that the coalition's invasion plans are already well advanced, and we would need months to properly organize and execute the defensive measures that such resistance would require. The weight of decision hung heavy in the throne room as the 4 members of their committee contemplated the choice between various forms of catastrophic risk. Princess Ilara realized that they had reached the moment she had been unconsciously preparing for throughout her life, the moment when theoretical knowledge about leadership and responsibility would be tested against the harsh realities of political survival. I call for a vote, she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were deciding. All in favor of implementing the resistance strategy should raise their hands now. Princess Ilara's own hand rose immediately, followed after a moment's hesitation by Captain Thornfield's. Prince Alexander struggled visibly with the decision, understanding that his vote would determine whether his future subjects would face the relative safety of foreign rule or the dangerous uncertainty of prolonged resistance. Finally, his hand rose as well, though his expression reflected the terrible burden of the choice. All eyes turned to Queen Isabella, who held the final vote that would determine the kingdom's fate. For what felt like an eternity, she stood motionless beside her throne, her gaze moving from her granddaughter to her son to the loyal captain who had served their family with distinction. When she finally raised her hand, Queen Isabella's voice carried a note of both resignation and determination. May God forgive us for what we are about to ask of our people, and may history judge that we chose the path of honor even when it led through darkness. The vote was unanimous, but Princess Ilara took no satisfaction in the victory. She understood that they had just committed their kingdom to a course of action that would test every citizen's courage, endurance, and loyalty. The easy certainties of royal privilege and traditional authority were about to be swept away by the harsh realities of survival and resistance. As the committee began to discuss the practical details of implementing their strategy, Princess Ilara realized that her intervention in the confrontation between her grandmother and Captain Thornfield had set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just the kingdom, but her own understanding of what it meant to lead and to serve. The 16-year-old princess who had stepped forward to prevent an act of violence had emerged from their week of investigation as someone prepared to make decisions that would affect generations of historians yet unborn. She had learned that true leadership sometimes required choosing between various forms of suffering rather than between good and evil, and that moral courage was measured not by the purity of one's choices but by the willingness to accept responsibility for their consequences. In the months and years that followed, as Astoria implemented its strategy of systematic resistance and the kingdom's fate hung in the balance, Princess Ilara would often reflect on the moment when she had chosen to speak rather than remain silent. That single act of intervention had prevented one crisis but had led inevitably to a much larger test of everything their family and their kingdom represented. The palace corridors that had once echoed with the comfortable routines of traditional monarchy would soon ring with the urgent preparations for a war unlike any their ancestors had faced. The young princess who had saved a captain from a queen's wrath had discovered that sometimes salvation required risking everything on principles that could not be measured in gold or guaranteed by treaties. As the sun set on their final day of investigation and, their first day of implementation, Princess Alara stood once again at the great windows of the throne room, looking out over the city that would soon become the heart of their resistance. She had learned that growing up meant accepting responsibility not just for one's own choices, but for their consequences in the lives of others. The story of Queen Isabella's attempted strike and Princess Alara's intervention would become a legend in Asturian history, but not for the reasons anyone might have expected. It would be remembered as the moment when a young princess discovered that true authority came not from the power to command, but from the courage to choose what was right even when all the choices were terrible. The great game of kingdoms and empires would continue to play out across the continent, but Astoria would face its trials with the knowledge that its royal family had been tested in the crucible of impossible decisions and had chosen to trust their people with the truth rather than burden them with comfortable lies. Princess Alara's journey from privileged royal daughter to reluctant architect of resistance had begun with a simple word: stop. But it would continue with a much more complex commitment, the promise to stand with her people through whatever trials lay ahead, whatever the cost to herself or her family's traditional conception of royal duty. In saving Captain Thornfield from her grandmother's anger, Princess Alara had discovered something more valuable than gold or territory: the knowledge that leadership meant being willing to sacrifice everything for the chance that something better might be possible, even when that possibility seemed impossibly distant and uncertain. In the grand halls of Ravencrest Palace, where centuries of tradition dictate every breath and bow, one moment of fury threatened to shatter the very foundation of the monarchy. Queen Isabella Ravencrest, known for her iron will and unforgiving nature, had finally reached her breaking point. The elite royal guard, sworn to protect the crown with their lives, had become the target of her rage. But, when her hand rose to strike Captain Marcus Thornfield in front of the entire court, nobody expected the soft voice that would cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "Grandmother, please stop." Princess Alara, barely 16 and fourth in line to the throne, stepped forward with a courage that belied her years. In that single moment, the fate of the kingdom hung in the balance, and a young princess would learn that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not with swords, but with words, wisdom, and an unwavering moral compass. This is the story of how one act of intervention changed the course of royal history forever, revealing secrets that had been buried for decades and forcing a powerful queen to confront the demons of her past.